For the hand that rocks the cradle is the hand that rules the world. The famous words of the poet Ross Wallace, a testament to the contribution of women towards a better world. Indeed, empowered women are a necessity for an economy, for a world that is rising back from a pandemic. However, are we doing enough to recognize their contribution, or are we repeating the mistakes of the history where we discount the importance of their contribution to the global economy? I'm Tharandu Amarasekara, and as always, BISNOMICS intends to be your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes in the month of March. However, with a simple twist to what we usually do. In this month, all our guests will be empowering female guests who will be coming to you with multiple different insights and intel from various industries and backgrounds. And kickstarting the month with you is none other than the country director for the International Labour Organization for Sri Lanka and Maldives, Ms. Simrin Singh. Ms. Simrin, absolute pleasure to have you with us, and welcome to BISNOMICS.
Thank you, Tharandu. Pleasure to be here.
I have a very pertinent topic to discuss with you today, and as you all know, it's about the labour markets of Sri Lanka and also from a more global context. We hear this term, Simrin, that people are the most important assets of a company and of a country. But I think we need to time and again ask, are companies doing enough for this most important asset? And even more importantly, what are the governments doing? What is the government of Sri Lanka doing for the people to uplift this labour market and make sure we have a dominant labour force? And labour is an area of passion to you, and I hope that your insights will indeed shed some thought on some of the pertinent issues with regard to labour. To kickstart things, I would like to ask you, what was the impact of the pandemic on the key labour market related issues of Sri Lanka? For example, we know we already had some structural issues, we had some issues with women not getting equal opportunities in the workforce and so on, but what was the exact impact of the pandemic on the labour issues of Sri Lanka? Let's start with that.
Okay, one simple term. The pandemic accelerated, unfortunately, negatively, some of the issues that were structurally already a struggle when it came to the Sri Lankan labour market. I can't divorce what's happened after the pandemic because it's an inheritance from what was there before. So let me talk to you a bit about both.
For sure.
What happened before, we knew when you speak, we're in the month of women. March is a month of women, empowering women. You will know that already the labor force participation rates for women in Sri Lanka were quite low and stagnating for 3 decades at 35%.
Correct.
That's quite an anomaly because they are very highly educated.
Correct.
So you had that issue already.
And just to add, Simran, I believe more than 70% of our graduates are women. And when
right.
only 35%, that means what's happening to the other half is the question.
Exactly. And then when you speak of graduates, another issue was very much youth unemployment. Many of them have graduated but aren't finding the kind of productive jobs that are needed afterwards. Sri Lanka was a bit higher than many other countries in the region and around the world at already over 20% of youth unemployment before the pandemic. You also had some serious structural issues in terms of not enough social protection going around and covering those that are in the informal sector. So 70% of Sri Lankan's workforce are working not in companies in private sector or government, but in what we call the informal sector. And many of them are own account workers, meaning they are self-employed, or they own little micro, small enterprises, you know, with less than 50 or sometimes even less than 15 employees. So you already had a labor market that was dominated actually not by people in the formal private sector or public sector, but in the informal sector, running day to day with these micro and small enterprises. So that was sort of the play of and without social protection coverage.
For sure.
So then you have all of a sudden the pandemic hit. And you really relied also very much actually on remittances and the GDP generated from migrant workers. 8% of the GDP was migrant worker remittances coming back. And a lot of expectation was in tourism, that the tourism sector would be the one that would be growing, creating jobs, generating income. And we know that already prior to the pandemic, it wasn't already not happening, but you had the Easter attacks, and that had its own repercussions as well. So all of a sudden you had kind of a perfect storm of not enough women in the labor market, not enough youth, a mismatch between who was trained and where the jobs are, not enough social protection to offset those that are vulnerable that might just fall off the deep end, and a labor market that was characterized mostly by people that were not in the formal sector. So you had all of those things happen already before, and then the pandemic hit. And certainly, as we've seen across the world, Sri Lanka is not unique, but across the world it has been devastating. Devastating when it comes to people's employment, how long they can work for, particularly for women, because the care burden on them actually intensified even more. People were getting sick, they were out of the labor market, they weren't able to enter. And youth in particular, here in Sri Lanka, one of the things that struck me, I already said youth unemployment was high prior to the pandemic. If you look at the second quarter of 2021, it was as high as 30% for youth. That's quite staggering. Quite staggering.
And alarming as well.
Yeah, exactly. And so really there is something to be said about this. And we saw certain trends also happen with regard to remittances. You had migrant workers that left, that actually initially wanted to really come back and did come back to Sri Lanka because Sri Lanka was safe or deemed to be safe compared to other countries. And now you will have also this issue of them going back out or trying to go out.
Record numbers of, record lengths of queues outside some of the passport offices and all that.
Yeah, I've seen the visuals. I don't have the data on to back that up, but certainly I've
Visuals
seen
the
visuals are long lines for sure. But you did also have a lot that came in, and they came in with a bunch of skills that they had from where they had worked, and that could be useful for Sri Lanka to rebuild and build back better too. So it's both sides, I think, when it comes to that equation, but it is something to look out for, and very, very important. One last thing that I think is a fundamental, which is the issue of labor laws. Labor laws are there to protect workers, but also companies. And some of the labor laws pre-pandemic were already being looked at from the lens of them being discriminatory towards women, and also not being adept necessarily to what you call now the gig economy, the platform economy, how the world of work has changed. It's not just a 9-to-5 office job anymore.
Absolutely.
There's so many different forms of work, and the supply chains are varied, even knowing no geographical boundaries, what are the jurisdictions. So there's a lot that needed to have happened before the pandemic, which has become even starker and more important post-pandemic, or well, during the pandemic as we stand now.
And even when it came to the matter of digital nomads, we found that while there were people interested to settle in Sri Lanka as digital nomads, I believe our legal system was not really catered or geared for allowing them. And is it a problem, Simrin, of the labor laws of Sri Lanka being a few waves behind the global developments? Is that a problem?
Well, I think when it comes to digital and platform and things, I think many countries,
gig
economies, I think many countries are still struggling. I mean, I don't think Sri Lanka is uniquely far behind, but it needs to catch up. It needs to get there very fast at this stage, because this is the way the world is going to be operating. And actually, with such a highly educated population, investments in harnessing digital literacy, and not just literacy, but being able to use it, these platforms to actually create an entrepreneurial culture, whether it be in tourism, whether it be in the care economy. There's so much potential for job-rich growth with a better digital knowledge and utility going forward. So I think we can't divorce that, and therefore the laws also really do need to be updated in that respect to be prepared for the 21st century, for the future of work, which is there to be.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the issue of the loss of skills, or rather the brain drain, as we can call it, because we do see heavy migrations, outflows of heavy migration. Is Sri Lanka facing an issue of a possible dearth of required labor into the future? Or, Simrin, I think the question is, are we already in that abyss that we would not like to be in, where we are losing out all the labor? Today, companies are complaining about the difficulties in finding even digital skills. And so many people are looking at moving into other countries. I believe some of the numbers of applications to countries like Canada and all are at an all-time high. Is this not going to be the next biggest economically devastating problem for Sri Lankan enterprises?
Probably not. If the right interventions are put in place. Let me also just correct one myth. Actually, when I said 8% of the GDP that came back from migrant workers into the economy, the vast bulk, majority of workers, migrant workers, are actually in the low-skilled or unskilled categories. So in the domestic workers and in the construction workers. The number of those that are in the skilled categories, so when you talk about brain drain, in a way you're thinking of higher skilled ones, the ones leaving companies, are not as many or have not been as many. And also the volume of remittances or investment back into Sri Lanka coming from them is actually a lot lower than the volume of the other low-skilled workers. Now that has to be transformed because Sri Lanka cannot at this point afford to have the higher skilled ones also leave and keep banking on this model of low-skilled workers going forward. And I'm pleased in many discussions with policymakers and government counterparts, they have this very strong and clear vision that they want to invest in skilling the migrant workers, outgoing potential ones, in higher end skills and negotiating bilateral deals with countries up, not the Middle East necessarily anymore, where there was a demand for domestics and construction, but in countries like Japan, Korea, Poland, where they are looking for higher skilled Sri Lankan migrant workers, and this would be a very good development, investing in the right kind of skill set, including in those that came back during the pandemic, that might be looking to go back. They've come with already some higher end skills. A little bit more investment in skilling them and upskilling them will actually yield a lot better results in terms of the investments they make coming back. That tie with Sri Lanka will remain. That's really, really essential to keep. So the idea and the real challenge and the need of the hour is to make sure that these migrant workers are not going through illegal means and disappearing, including the higher end ones, but that there's a system in place to monitor, to track, to facilitate that migration, and especially of higher skilled ones, so that you actually get much more returns. And it's a small investment to make. These people are already very talented, and I think it's important that we see it from that perspective, as opposed to every migrant worker going and bidding adieu to Sri Lanka. I think
that's not something which the nation can afford right now.
Simply cannot afford, and it shouldn't be the way either. You have a lot of talent here and a lot of potential. So if we can channel that energy and investment in the people, you will see those returns coming back to Sri Lanka.
Thank you so much for the insightful start to the discussion, Simrin. We are going to continue this after the short break. How big a problem is human trafficking globally and in Sri Lanka? Let's talk about that on the other side of this short break. This is BISNOMICS. Welcome back to BISNOMICS, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. We are in conversation with Ms. Simrin Singh, Country Director for the International Labour Organization for Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Simrin, let's talk about the pertinent issue of human trafficking. I believe there's a lot of awareness being raised even in Sri Lanka by various organizations, including yourself, on this issue of human trafficking, how not to get caught to these human trafficking racketeers, which then ends up in so many other vulnerabilities, from forced labor and even issues of organs being removed from various individuals. I mean, and the list gets darker and more sinister as we discuss. But this human trafficking, how do we exactly define it? And globally and in a Sri Lankan context, how big a problem is this? Because I read that tens of millions of people are getting trafficked every year. Clearly, this is a bigger problem than what is being discussed. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, certainly the issue of human trafficking is one of a deep concern, and it has been actually linked to what the ILO has been working on for its 100 years. We're a 100-year-old organization. One of the first few areas that we worked on was this issue of slavery and forced labor, as we call it. And with time, human trafficking, especially the movements across borders and the illicit nature of this activity, actually also has been included in our ILO standards when it comes to forced labor. So human trafficking is one of those areas, when you ask for numbers, how big or how small is it and how prevalent is it, there are many estimates. It's over 100 million, but it's probably a very serious underestimate because it's very difficult to actually capture this data because if
It's
it's
not
illicit.
something where you can go and do a research.
Yeah, you can't, no, because it's hidden. It's often, it's illicit, it's hidden, it's not out in the view, so it's very difficult to go and do a traditional survey and say, hey, you're in forced labor or you're a victim of trafficking. Yeah. There's also a lot of ethics surrounding victims of human trafficking to be able to gather that data. So,
and correct me if I'm wrong, Simrin, and at the same time, it's not necessarily something limited only to the developing countries or the poor countries, because I believe some of the reports a decade ago found that even in US, in some of the most lush neighborhoods, that they found forced labor, girls working in salons, and they were forced to work there.
Yeah, not just the US, the UK, you name it, all over. You have this, and the nail salons, the tomato farms, agriculture work. I mean, these are all where you have labor shortages, where you have labor market inequalities. There is a tendency to fill it through these illicit means when you have desperate people that really what they want is to be able to take care of their families and their communities back home. Their living situations are so bad, and then they get preyed on by this and exploited by traffickers. And unfortunately,
including some of the trucks laden with dead bodies of people where they were trafficking them, and they just parked it somewhere and disappeared, no ventilation, and they passed away. Tragic, yeah, absolutely tragic.
No, those are the extreme cases that the media has picked up on, and it's very important they expose it. But I think we should also focus on what's hidden and isn't exposed when it doesn't reach that.
Once in plain sight.
Yeah.
Hidden in plain sight.
Yeah, hidden in plain sight. And this is exactly the working conditions where wages are not being paid, where someone has illegally recruited them on the promise of getting them out. So again, this links with this issue of labor migration and safe labor migration, because that's not what's happening. You borrow to be able to go and get that visa or somehow manage to get that flight out, and then you are indebted and you have to pay your wages for who knows how many years. You have not negotiated your own contract with your employer wherever you are, right? You don't know what your living arrangements are. Stories of people sleeping on kitchen floors, if that, or in toilets, as opposed to, having the kind of accommodation you should as a worker or an employee, not having a formal contract, your passports confiscated. Those are all indicators of what we consider to be forced labor or human trafficking as well. And that is where it comes across in the world of work. And many more women tend to be victims of this because of, again, the nature of the work they end up looking for. Domestic work is one which is very much a tricky one where exploitation takes place. And frankly, here in Sri Lanka, I would say that, we don't have, again, statistics on how many people are victims of human trafficking, but the nexus between labor migration and unsafe labor migration and human trafficking couldn't be more apt, because it's what's happening. We did a study here. Many of the prospective migrants will not go to official channels to be able to figure out how they can be going as an official labor migrant. They will go to someone familiar. Not even a registered recruitment agent. A recruitment agent sounds like someone official, right? Actually, no, it could be an uncle or someone in your community who you trust. And even if, to get you through. And this trust issue is very fundamental in terms of the knowledge of how you migrate. So if at the very start you're starting from an exploitative, uninformed perspective, the chances that you're actually trafficked and end up in a situation of forced labor or human trafficking is very, very probable. And that is actually a real loss for the country. When you're talking about, how many people, can I tell you that we estimated something like $150 billion in profits from this lucrative human trafficking industry. So that is all that money, 150 billion, okay, globally, not Sri Lanka necessarily, but $150 billion in profits. Can you imagine if that was
channeled? That's bigger than the Sri Lankan GDP.
Can you imagine if that money was actually channeled back into the country and economy? What a loss it is to the member states around the world by this illicit activity.
And I think, Simrin, we also need to address the fact that out of this, proportionately around 70% of those who are facing these trafficking is actually women, which further compounds an already complicated and complex problem.
Indeed. Often they think that women are being trafficked for sexual exploitation or sexual slavery. Actually, that's not the case. Actually, both men and women are being trafficked, and a lot of them are being trafficked, a majority for labor issues, for labor exploitation, forced labor situations. So I think also the media traditionally has painted faces of women, especially from Asia, showing up in Europe or wherever else.
But it can happen to anybody, anywhere.
Yeah, there is also possibly a dimension of sexual exploitation associated with their forced labor situation or trafficking situation, but human trafficking is not sex trafficking. There's a huge labor dimension to the trafficking and serious profits to be made. I mean, I used to work in Thailand before, and we did have issues of actually labor shortages in the seafood industry there. And they needed workers, and there were unfortunately similar unsafe migration issues so that they would work in these clandestine fishing operations. So it was linked to labor and needing laborers to work in some of these 3D jobs, the dirty, devalued, undignified type of work. That's where you end up with very vulnerable people being susceptible and then put into a situation of human trafficking.
So the overall forced labor trafficking seems to be a bigger problem than the sex trafficking itself. Simrin, in terms of the economic impact, yes, you did put a certain value to that, but that's more like a numerical one. What are the overall economically negative consequences we see as a result of this trafficking? And I mean, you've done your research, you've seen this happening. What are the signs that something is wrong or that there is some trafficking happening in a particular neighborhood? Because when people are aware of this, what's hidden in plain sight can be revealed.
Yeah, well, I think having community vigilance is essential. And indeed, this is a very good question, like what are the markers you're looking for? Often you find when people are extremely vulnerable and you have perhaps situations of domestic abuse or people are hidden, and not coming out of the house, situations of that nature. I think those are sometimes sort of red flags to look out for. But it's a very difficult thing. It's better that you have community vigilance groups that are aware of what is happening and then also aware of who is going out or who's looking to out-migrate. I think in Sri Lanka that's very important to have that awareness as to who and why you might be looking to go out and to then channel them through regular channels, official channels that are there. We have district officers that are actually stationed to actually facilitate the safe labor migration journey, to facilitate all of that. But then people are still going to these recruitment agents, as I said. So if the community is not aware of what that means and how bad the exploitation could be or what the consequences could be once you're at the other end, I think we will be fighting an uphill battle. This is a very...
It's not something only for ILO.
Yeah,
I think the community has to be aligned with identifying these factors as well. I think.
Yeah, and I don't think it's also just a pure enforcement issue. This is a prevention issue before anything else. If you can prevent it from happening, you will not have to deal with the repercussions. And the prevention really goes from having that facilitated systems in place to try to ensure that migration in particular happens in a safe, orderly way, that at the recruitment stage already you're not getting into a terrible situation that just has that domino effect by the time you go. Other, signs of trafficking are clearly, as I was saying, if you are not getting paid your wages, if your passport or other identity documents, for example, have been confiscated, then you don't have that power and that agency to be able to go and report or seek redress. Certainly physical signs. You also have, emotional, psychological signs that you start to observe. Someone is troubled, is not sleeping enough, all of those compounded mental health issues also start to surface. And if you have a good supportive community network, I think you're able to pick up on a number of those issues, and then you know what to do, because I think part of the reason why people don't do much is that they actually feel helpless. They don't know what they're supposed to do. Who are they supposed to go to, and if they go to the police, will it make its situation worse? So there's a lot of these myths again that need to be busted, but also systems and processes that need to be service and client oriented to really deal with this situation. But bottom line is, frankly, if wages were good, if good jobs were available, if these structural issues that we're talking about, right, in the labor market were okay, then there's no incentive and there's very little scope for trafficking to occur and for people to be exploited.
Some very valid thoughts there, Simrin. The mandate of the ILO towards better working conditions for the labour market of Sri Lanka. Let's talk about that on the other side of this short break. This is BISNOMICS. Welcome back to BISNOMICS, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. I'm Tharandu Amarasekara. Our focus today is on the labour market of Sri Lanka, the pertinent issues and what needs to be done to address them. And we are in conversation with Simrin Singh, the country director for the International Labour Organization for Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Simrin, let's talk about Human Development Plan for Sri Lanka. We hear the government talking about it, the authorities talking about it all the time, but in reality, an effective, proper Human Development Plan for Sri Lanka, what should it really entail?
Okay, Tharandu, very, very good question, and especially pertinent now as we are emerging and trying to recover from the pandemic. The ILO has called for a human-centered recovery, which means that the nexus between economic regrowth or redevelopment and employment has to be very, very clear. You cannot divorce economic growth from employment. It needs to be a job-rich, human-centered recovery. And as
Job-rich, human-centered.
Job-rich, human-centered,
Makes
indeed.
economic sense too.
It does indeed. So this is where this human development plan needs to feature very strongly. And I think at the heart of it, here in Sri Lanka in particular, lies the skilling. Skilling from the school to work transition, skilling from early, not late, skilling for the 21st century we're operating in at this stage, and skilling for lifelong learning. Because Sri Lanka is very unique. Both has a young youth, we talked about youth unemployment, right? We talked about women, also very low labor force participation. So those are two segments. But mind you, Sri Lanka is an aging economy, a country, aging society, and you have a lot of people that are elderly that will become dependent on the state or other families at the cost again of women participating in the labor force. So it's really important that when you look at human capital development, that you don't just focus on the young and women. They're very, very important, but also on the elder. Look at it as a continuum of lifelong learning, which is very essential going forward, because as we know already, prior to the pandemic, people were changing occupations at least 7 or 8 times, in their lifetimes, and it's only been accelerated. The scope for employment in Sri Lanka, as we see it, is very much on this self-employment, micro, small enterprises model. That's already fueling 70% of the country prior to this. So you have this demographic that's trying to be entrepreneurial, trying to get market linkages, trying to get their products, their services out, but there hasn't been enough facilitation. So it's really important that not only are we looking at skilling people in where the jobs will be, and by and large, my sense is in Sri Lanka, it's going to be the service sector, more so than manufacturing, because it cannot compete with many of the countries around the neighborhood or the region. But services is indeed going to be a real huge area for employment going forward. And we need to have people that are trained to be able to do so, plus the facilitation to see that they have access to the capital needed, the finances needed, and hand-holding thereafter going forward. So this is something that has not, we are in the decade of skills right now. In Sri Lanka, we are talking about investing in entrepreneurship, but I think the ecosystem, the facilitation from the state, but also in partnership with the private sector, is essential in making sure that that entrepreneurship and investment in the right kind of skills is there, and for the right populations, and not just saying, we're only going to deal with university graduates, or we'll just have a little exclusive program for women. That's not going to work. It needs to be seen in the broad continuum and the holistic in terms of where the needs are, where the job. A real better way of finding out where the supply and demand is, as opposed to just 6 months or 1 year long courses in a skill, and then that skill is no longer valid. It's turning obsolete. So that is very important, and the right labor market actors need to be in that conversation. This is not an academic exercise. This has to have those people that are out there, those very entrepreneurs, those micro, small enterprises, as well as private sector, government, and unions, workers' representatives, to come up with a proper human development plan and financing to make it happen.
Simrin, we always hear this term that we need to give more opportunities for the women to participate in the workforce. The sentiments have been echoed very strongly and clearly by you. But I personally feel one of the reasons why probably this is not getting off the ground is that while as a concept and a sentiment it's being shared, perhaps we are not really sharing the science and the true economic science behind it. Now, from the research of ILO, what's the science behind it? Why does it make more economic sense? Beyond the obvious, of course, of giving more labor participation. And we saw even countries like Japan coming out of recessions, they said, forget the tradition, forget the culture, come and participate in the workforce. Now, beyond, on a similar sense, why does it make better economic sense to allow women to participate in the workforce more?
Okay, no, good question. I think there was a study done very recently by OECD in OECD countries, and they, I'm not a statistician and all of that, but basically the fact was that they estimated that if there was a slight increase in women's labor force participation, where they're not 50%, so 50%, there's no equity still. It's already low around the world. If it went up a certain amount, you would see a 6% increase in GDP. But if you found an equitable, so if you found an actual matching male-female labor force participation rate, by the year 2030, you'd have a 12% increase in GDP in those countries. So I leave it to those people that can crunch the numbers and know all the, the formulas in which to, the science behind it. But I thought that that was really compelling, and it makes a lot of sense, Tarindu, because basically what's coming at a cost, we know that women are spending a lot more of their productive working time, even if they're working in care work. And the first to suffer if someone falls sick or childcare issues are the women that drop out. So you have an unfair and unusually extra burden on women, which is not allowing them to be as productive. So they can't even do the 9-to-5 job if they were given that option because of these other, and that eats into the earnings. And we also know that women are earning less actually than men equivalent, even in the Western world, not just here in Sri Lanka. So if you look at all those factors, if there's pay equity, equal pay for work of equal value, right? And then you have an environment where women are able to actually work those hours that they need to instead of bypassing it for care responsibilities. And then if you have enough investment in women so that they can actually not just sit and sew garments in the factory floor, but then can become managers, etc. You see huge dividends. We have our own ILO program. It's called the Better Work Program. It's one of our flagship programs in the apparel sector around the world. And I can tell you that over the past 15 years or so, really serious impact studies have been done in terms of women and what impact that meant if they were moving up also management positions. So not only were they employed, but moving up. And you saw a 25% increase in profits as a result of women in those apparel enterprises. Clear economic science, Tufts University, you name it. This is a very well thoroughly researched, so it's not to be disputed.
Simrin, on a final note, there's no dispute in the fact that the ILO has been contributing to better work conditions and safer labor conditions around the world for many decades, and it's a commendable job. I would like to give you this opportunity to shed some light on what are the programs, initiatives by the ILO in Sri Lanka especially, and are there any projects that the private sector or the community can come and collaborate with you to help you to further these endeavors?
Okay. No, thank you for that opportunity. Actually, we are very much already engaging with the private sector as well as with workers' organizations and the government, amidst others, partners as well. But I think there's 3 core areas of our work, and it's just as relevant post-pandemic, etc. Biggest one is on employment, and employment and economic development is where we really need partnerships with also the private sector. We have engagements already, but here in terms of employment, it's about creating market linkages. It's about financing for these micro, small enterprises so they can really actually thrive and contribute to the economy. So we've partnered, for example, with several banks in the banking sector, stimulus packages that were offered for micro, small enterprises, especially women-owned ones in particular. there. So the employment market linkages side of things is very, and that's where the skills investment, capital development, as well as the entrepreneurship avenue. We have some fairly large programs in that area, and we are looking to expand partnerships. And I think even an outfit like yours would be very important to try to make a spirit of entrepreneurship something much more palatable and attractive, because we do find cultural barriers very much when it comes to the employment of women, to entering and becoming a risk taker as an entrepreneur, etc. Sure. Employment is one. The second is what we call labor market governance, and that's where these issues of labor laws come in that we were talking about, revisions, where it comes to handling disputes, agreeing on what are wages, making sure that social protection is given to those that are unemployed. We've actually worked very closely with the Ministry of Tourism, that's been hard hit, on coming up with a employment-related social protection scheme for tourism sector employees that we hope to expand to informal sector employees, working closely with different partners on that. And the third is on vulnerable workers, those that are victims or might become victims of trafficking, migrant workers, the issue of child labor. And I'm quite worried, to be honest, with the pandemic and the devastating impact it's had on the economy and on the people's livelihoods, that we might see a reverse in trend and an increase in human trafficking and in child labor in a country that was boasting having barely any child labor over the last decade. So these are areas that I really look to continue working on. We also really would like to expand our footprint and work on this issue of what we call a just transition to environmental sustainability. As a small island state, and one that is affected quite a lot by climate, droughts and floods and everything else, I think this climate agenda is center stage, and if we're looking at a human-centered recovery, we cannot do it without looking at it from a green recovery side. So that's another angle, and leaving no one behind, certainly women, those with disabilities, the youth, and the elderly. So this lifelong learning is something we're going to continue to invest in: employment, labor market governance, and rights of vulnerable workers in particular.
Simrin, they say empowered women empower women. You're an empowered woman. If you were given 30 seconds to give a message of empowerment to all the women, the female members of our audience, what would that message be?
Find a mentor and just follow your dreams. I mean, it's going to be a tough road. It's going to be a tough road, but there are people and entities that are behind you, and you will succeed if you put your heart and your mind to it. Don't be daunted by it, as daunting as it seems that, there are barriers. But I know it's hard to say, but, we're there for you. We've been there. There's plenty of other women out there that have been there for you. There's plenty of men that have been there, that are out there for you, that can support you. So please, this is the 21st century. You're allowed to think out of the box, and you will be supported if you find and reach out. You could never have been more connected than you are now to so many resources to support you.
Simrin Singh, Country Director for the International Labour Organization for Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Absolute pleasure hosting you. You were very passionate about what you believe in, and I sincerely hope that this would inspire more women out there to be inspirational and passionate about what they do. And as I said at the start, it's the hand that rocks the cradle that indeed rules the world, and a stronger hand in ruling that world will definitely mean a better world for all of us. Thank you for joining us, and wish you and the team at the ILO all the best in your future endeavors.
Thank you, Tarindu, and I hope that we have men also join in rocking that cradle. I think it takes men and women together to actually achieve what we want to achieve.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. No matter what business you may be in, giving equal opportunities to women to participate in that activities of your organization and the economy overall definitely makes better economic sense as well as more societal sense as well. And I wish and hope that the week ahead will be an empowering one for you, where you move above and beyond your goals and targets. I'm Tharandu Amarasekara, and no matter what business you may be in, have a profitable week ahead. This is BISNOMICS.